Dr. Cheryl Ganz is an accomplished aerophilatelist with specialization in airship mail. A past president of the American Airmail Society, Cheryl retired as the chief curator of the Smithsonian National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. That's a place I would encourage every one of you to visit. She signed the role of Distinguished Philatelist at the Royal Philatelic Society, London, and serves as the president of the American Philatelic Society. They are headquartered in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, another place I seriously encourage all of you to visit. Her numerous Zeppelin mail-related achievements include a large gold at IBRA 2023, books on the subject, and a lively Facebook group which she administers. Sharing a common interest in the subject, I had the good fortune of being connected with Cheryl for some years now, and always look to her for guidance as I continue my airship mail-related studies and collection. Cheryl, we look forward to your talk. Over to you.
Well, first, thank you, PK. Thanks to everyone who helped put on this wonderful event, and I'm very honored to be part of it. I've been an aerophilatelist since I was a teenager. I think what really excited me about airmail, and especially Zeppelin mail, which is my specialty, is that there are always new discoveries to be found. The catalogs are far from complete. And when we find new discoveries, there's always new research to do and new articles and books to be published. And this has sustained my interest all these years. And so today what I'm going to talk about is one of the new research projects, a little small story I've been working on. So often people write about the bigger picture. And today what I'm going to do is take that bigger picture and use a single case study of the Basel, Switzerland dispatches to help people understand the bigger picture of international foreign mail carried by the German Zeppelins. So even if you don't collect Swiss airmail, I'm hoping that you can take some of my ideas and apply them to your own way of collecting the countries of your choice. So this is an idea of how a vision became reality. On the photograph on the left, you have Hugo Echner pointing toward a map. And he was the leader of the Zeppelin company in Germany. It was known as Luftschiffbau Zeppelin. And he had a vision that Zeppelins could cross, German Zeppelins specifically, could cross the Atlantic Ocean and go to North America and South America. Because at that time, in the 1920s and 30s, airplanes didn't have the power to carry the payload, passengers, freight, and mail. Everything was still going sea mail. So his idea of Zeppelins were the carrier across the oceans. On both sides of the ocean, the networks of airplanes could meet the passengers, freight, and mail and deliver anywhere in the world. And in fact, that became true. On the picture on the right is from a 1937 Lufthansa German airmail brochure that shows how already mail could be distributed to so many places, including Asia and Australia, from the Zeppelin connections. And I wanted to point out as well that not only did Zeppelins carry mail across the Atlantic, but Graf Zeppelin carried the first commercial scheduled mail to South America, and the Hindenburg carried the first regularly scheduled airmail to North America. So while Zeppelins were a very short window of opportunity in the 20s and 30s, they were absolutely essential to the network of connecting world airmail. And we would not have had international mail like we do had it not been for Zeppelins. So this is part of the major significance of why Zeppelin mail is so important. I should also add that not only did they carry mail by air, they did it in less than half the time of ship mail. So while we have so much collector mail out there, there's also commercial mail for banks and businesses that wanted to outdo their competitors. Paying the extra fee for airmail would help them have an advantage of several days on each end of the story. So just in case there's someone in the audience who doesn't know what a Zeppelin is, I'll just give a quick explanation. This is the Hindenburg, a German Zeppelin. It is known as a rigid airship. That means it has a metal framework. Inside that metal framework are gas bags. On the Hindenburg, they held hydrogen, which is lighter than air. On American ships, they held helium. And then covering that metal structure is a fabric. And down at the bottom, you can see suspended from the ship is a control car where the officers could do navigation. On the Hindenburg, you can see on the lower center some windows. That was the passenger quarters. Different ships would have different configurations. The Germans were the masters of Zeppelins, to the point where it was no longer an experiment. It was a safety operation. Graf Zeppelin flew from 28 to 37 without ever a loss of life on almost 1,000 flights, carrying passengers, mail, and freight. British and America airships, rigid airships, were still more what I would call an experimental airship style, and often military as opposed to commercial. So the first thing I want to talk about in the big picture is what is treaty mail. And there have been debates in aerophilatelic literature over, is treaty mail the correct term for mail from international countries, foreign mail to Germany? Should we be calling it this? And some people say, no, it should be called transmitted mail. They come up with all kinds of names for it. But I was able to discover that in the 19th century, sea mail had treaty mail, and that's where the actual term comes from. And this is when you had postal agreements between two countries on how they could exchange mail. This is outside the UPU regulations. And so that same idea of these private negotiations continued with airmail into the 20th century, still continued to call it treaty mail. And the post office could have an agent represent them. And in the case of the Zeppelins, Hugo Echner and some of his agents represented the Zeppelin company for negotiations. So, for example, in the United States, Hugo Echner made several trips here, and his U.S. representative, Willy von Meister, both went to the post office regularly to negotiate contracts, except they weren't contracts. They were treaty mail. There is no signed contract. This is what makes it so difficult for Zeppelin scholars, is we can't find all these contracts. It's because they're two guys shaking hands and making an agreement. And what I have found in some archives is simply a letter that will say, it was great to have met you, and I'm glad we could agree that 85% of the cost of the Zeppelin post will go to the Zeppelin company and post office can keep the 15%. That's how it operated. So it's a lot of digging to find some of those documents, but a few of them exist, and of course a lot of that kind of documentation hasn't survived. So continuing on treaty mail, those negotiations would get mail from foreign countries onto the Zeppelin, and the Zeppelin would fly it. But then what happens when the Zeppelin lands? Well, fortunately, that's where the UPU regulations come into the picture. They had a framework that said different countries will deliver the mail to the address, and this was absolutely crucial as well. So you could literally have any country of the world dispatch a piece of mail to a Zeppelin if there had been a treaty agreement, and you could have it upon landing delivered to any country in the world. So for my case study today, to look at how this operated, I'm looking at Basel, Switzerland. And here's a small map, shows Basel in the center. Why is Basel so important? Well, it was strategically located where three countries in Europe all come together: Germany, France, and Switzerland. And this is important because Basel was a railroad hub for all three countries. It had a train station that had both a French and Swiss train station operating, and it had another train station that was a German train station. Plus, it had an airport. So it made it convenient for operating, sending Zeppelin mail toward Germany. And I will talk more about that as well. So now Basel was designated by the Swiss Post Office as its postal exchange office for Zeppelin mail. So what is a postal exchange office? And that means all over Switzerland, if they wanted Zeppelin mail to go to Frankfurt, Germany, to go on board the Hindenburg or Graf Zeppelin flying out of Frankfurt, every city in Switzerland would send its mail to Basel. And the Basel II post office would then take that mail and track it, make documents. How many pieces of postcards on this? How many letters? What is the value of the postage? So everybody gets paid, because now we're looking at Switzerland, Germany, and the Zeppelin company all wanting a piece of that pie, and sorting it according to destinations and determining routing. So all of this was done in Basel before it's then sent on to Frankfurt. And that's what the exchange office handles. Before we had the exchange office, and before we had these treaty agreements, you had to put stamps on from each country that carried that mail. So in this example, you have a piece of mail that was going to fly across the Atlantic on the LZ-126, which later became the ZR-3 Los Angeles, operated by the US Navy. And for that flight, if you were in Switzerland, you had to put a Swiss stamp on to get it to Germany, and then a German stamp to get it across the Atlantic Ocean. So that's pre-treaty. Once you've got the agreements, now you only need Swiss postage, and the Swiss postage can do the entire trip. In this case, it gets it from Romanshorn, which was the exchange office for Friedrichshafen, where the Graf Zeppelin had its home base. So you had this from Romanshorn, would go across the lake on a ferry, get put on the Zeppelin, fly to Brazil, and then fly on to Argentina, all paid for by Swiss postage, with the revenue being divided according to where it belonged. So I'll give you an idea of that route across the lake. It's Lake Constance, which in German is called the Bodensee. So at the left, you have the harbor at Romanshorn, and you can see this is a photograph from the time period of the Zeppelins. You can see what the ships looked like that would have carried the mail across the lake after it had been organized and tracked at the Romanshorn post office. And it's a short ferry ride. I've done it many times myself, probably less than an hour. And then when it reaches the Friedrichshafen harbor, which is in the lower right, at that time, the post office was right at the front by the harbor, so it was very easy for the mail to be moved from the ship to the post office. The post office would further sort it and gather it together with mail from other places, and then transfer it to the airfield. Now, if you look at the town and you look in the upper right, you can kind of see a field in the background. That's where the Zeppelin company owned property. It had its offices and hangars and a landing field in the back part of town there. So when the Hindenburg was built, and the Hindenburg operated in 1936 and 1937 until its crash at Lakehurst, it was built in Friedrichshafen, where the Zeppelin hangars were and where the Zeppelin company was headquartered. But it had a new base built for it. Its home port was going to be in Frankfurt at Rhein-Main. And today, if you've ever flown in and out of the airport in Frankfurt, that's exactly the location where the Zeppelin hangars used to be. The problem was, if you were going to send Swiss mail across the ferry to Friedrichshafen to go on the Hindenburg out of Frankfurt, there was no direct train line. So that meant they would send it by train to Stuttgart. It would have to get off one train, be put onto another train, and then go to Frankfurt. The entire trip took well over 10 hours, not including the ferry boat. So Basel, Switzerland, had direct trains to Frankfurt. And Basel could make it from, on that train line, could make it to Frankfurt in about 5 hours, half the time of going from Friedrichshafen, and no ferry boat involved. So this was the main reason why they opened a second Zeppelin Post exchange office. Romanshorn continued to service Friedrichshafen, and now Basel would service Frankfurt. Both Hindenburg and Graf Zeppelin flew out of both sites. Graf Zeppelin continued with Friedrichshafen as its home base, and Hindenburg had Rhein-Main as its home base. So here we are in Basel. This large, gorgeous building is the post office, Basel II post office that held the postal exchange. It's built, as you can see, right next door to the main station, train station in Basel. This meant any town in the country of Switzerland could easily get its mail to Basel quickly because they have such a wonderful network of trains. This building was built in 1910. Torn down in 1975, another building, post office building put up, which was recently torn down, and now they're in the process of building the third Basel II post office on this site. So a lot of things would happen at this location. It's a place where, I'll move to the next one so you can see. It's a place where the Basel Exchange Office would look at the mail, determine what train it should go on in order to get there in time. So here we have the German trains in the Swiss main station, and below I have excerpts of the train line that would go direct to Frankfurt. There were only 4 trains a day that did. Now, the Zeppelin often left in the early morning, and the reason for that was because the temperature and the weather was better for the lift of the airship. So if you wanted to get mail to Switzerland, from Switzerland to Frankfurt, you probably wanted it on an evening train to catch the morning flight. So you figure it's about a 5-hour trip to get up to Frankfurt, and then once there, and it goes by a steam engine. This is the Reichsbahn that actually was traveling between Basel and Frankfurt. And once it gets there, then the crew at the Frankfurt 19 post office at the train station would work through the night, sort the mail to get it to the airfield for a morning takeoff. So on the left, you can see the Frankfurt main train station still standing. And where I have the red circle, that's where the post office is, post office 19. And so they would take the mail not just from Switzerland, but from a lot of other places, including all over Germany, and postmark it, sort it, prepare it, put it in sealed bags so it would be loaded onto the Zeppelin already sealed. And the cover at the right, you can see, has a Frankfurt Bahn Postamt, that means train post office, 19 postmark. So that is from that post office. This one happens to be going to British East India. So once you've loaded up the mail bags onto a vehicle, because in 1936-37, there was no train line between the Frankfurt main station and the Rhein-Main airport. So it had to go by vehicle. So you loaded the bags and you went by vehicle out to the airfield. Up at the north end of it, you can see where it says it's the airport terminal. That's where we believe the airport post office was located. And then the 2 larger red images you see, those are the 2 airship hangars, one of which would have had the Hindenburg in it for loading, although by the time the mail came, it was probably already out on the field and easy to load. In the photograph at left, you can see one of the hangars and a big highway right alongside it. They were very proud of their new highway. And on the map where you see that highway right across from Rhein-Main and across the highway is the little town of Zeppelinheim. And Zeppelinheim is still there. This was a company town built for crew members who could live there with their families and just walk underneath the highway over to the landing field. So it was easy for them to access their job. The rates for Switzerland Zeppelin flights follow the same pattern of so many other countries. First, you would take the country's regular international rates, and back in 36, 37, those often weren't airmail rates, they were just standard international rates. And you would add to that a special Zeppelin rate, which is what the treaty agreement had planned with the country. And then if you had anything like registration or special services that were allowed, you could add that as well. This chart gives you cards, letters, and printed matter. There were other little varieties that I haven't put on the chart. But a couple things that are important to note is that the rates for North America often varied from South America, and they varied from 1936 to 1937. 1937, there were times when only printed matter could fly on the Zeppelin, because at that time, Deutsche Lufthansa was using airplanes and catapults to fly some of the, what we would call first-class type of mail, so that the Zeppelins were only carrying the heavy load, lower value mail. There is, if you look at where I've got the Olympic flight, it has an inclusive price. There were special flights that would be inclusive. In other words, that determined amount, they had agreed how much would go to Swiss Post, how much would go to Germany and the Zeppelin company. In the beginning, even in the United States, if you think of 1929, when Graf Zeppelin went around the world, we used our domestic and international rates and added to them Zeppelin rates, depending on the legs chosen. And probably over 50% of the mail is wrongly franked, underfranked, or overfranked, so that the next year in 1930, when the Graf Zeppelin came to the United States, the post office went to an inclusive price. And that was to reduce all the confusion, not just for the senders, but for the postal clerks as well. So it was kind of a transition period of trying to figure out rates. And now we'll look at some of this mail. This is canceled at Basel II. That's the post office I showed you the image of. Going to the United States. It's going to fly on the Hindenburg on the 6th flight to North America. In 1936, Hindenburg made 10 flights to North America, plus flights to South America and local flights. On the reverse, it tells me that it was train number 85. But the fun thing about this cover is it's addressed to Louise Lichtenstein, later Louise Boyd Dale, who ended up as head of the Philatelic Foundation in the United States, our leading, one of our leading expertising firms. And it is sent by her father, Alfred Lichtenstein, who was a very famous philatelist and was head of the 1936 International Show in New York. He happened to be a chemist, and he was the U.S. President of Ciba, a big chemical company that was based in Switzerland. So he frequently would go to Switzerland and set this on one of his business trips home. Here's another example with a Basel II marking. This on the back has train number 191, and it's flown on a different Hindenburg flight. This is on the 9th. And so you see these round red circular cachets, the one here at left. In 36, they would have a different cachet for each of the flights as a kind of a confirmation marking that it was on that flight. So, well, if you're sending letters to North America, you would think, okay, most of them are probably going to the United States, and that's true. But some mail going to North America would then be forwarded to other countries. And in this case, I'm showing examples from Costa Rica and Mexico. So what would happen is the mail would go to Lakehurst, starting out in Basel by train, by Zeppelin to Lakehurst. And then from Lakehurst, it would go up to New York by train or airplane. Both were available. And then it would fly to Miami, and in Miami be put on a foreign airmail route going down to one of these countries. And there were special rates depending on how you were extending your trip by airplane. So here we have a Bern dispatch on train 85. It arrived from Bern to Basel by train too late to catch the Graf Zeppelin flight to South America. So the Zeppelin exchange office in Basel held it. Rather than sending it to Frankfurt and letting Frankfurt 19 hold it over for the next trip, the Basel post office held it for the next trip, which would have been a South America flight by Hindenburg, which is how it flew. So it's just another example of how that exchange office would look at a cover. It would make sure it had the right franking on it or whether it needed postage due. It would look at the schedule to see what train it needed to be on in order to catch which flight. Here's one of the inclusive rates. This is the Olympic flight. Kind of fun, right in the middle, you can see the airport cancel from Rhein-Main. Flügen Luftschiffhafen means airplane and airship base at Rhein-Main. And when I was in Switzerland doing research in the Paganini archive, I found several PTT documents that went out to the various post offices in Switzerland, directing them to send their mail to Basel for Zeppelin flights. And in this example is about send your mail in time to catch a train to get on this Olympic flight. But if you don't get there in time for the last train, there will be a night flight from the Basel airport to Frankfurt. And so this helped all the postal clerks understand what they needed to do, what the rates were, so that they could check the mail, put it under cover, and send it on to the Basel Exchange Office. The Basel Exchange Office also handled mail for Zeppelins that came out of Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein didn't have an airport, and it's, for most of you probably know, it's a very small country, very tied to Switzerland, right next to it. And so in this case, the mail would go by train from Liechtenstein to Basel and then onward. In this example, it was destined for Brazil, to South America, on the Graf Zeppelin. It was franked with the letter rate, even though it was a postcard. So you can see up at the top corner, originally the term postcard is printed on there. They misfranked it for a postcard, they overpaid. And then someone changed it to printed matter. And I don't know for sure if that's the Basel Post Office or German, but as soon as it went to printed matter, the rate dropped even further. So any way you looked at it, it's misfranked and overfranked, and still an interesting story. And you can see there, train 41. If you look at that, the cancel, the post office train cancel, it says Frankfurt to Basel. Even if it's Basel to Frankfurt, it still used that same marking, no matter which direction the train was going. And then Bahnpost means train mail. Zug is the German word for train, then the train number. And when you look at the date, you always in German get the day, then the month, then the year. So in conclusion, I'd like to give you suggestions if you're interested in Zeppelin mail and what you might do next. Across the top row, I've got 3 catalogs that you might be interested in. First is the Swiss Airmail Handbook. A new edition of that is coming out this year. Next is the Seeger Zeppelin catalog. That is in German. The last edition by the Seeger firm has been published because they have now gone out of business. And then finally, the Mickel catalog. This is the English edition I'm showing, but there's a more recent edition in German. So those are the 3 major catalogs. Of course, there's many more books, and the literature is extensive in Zeppelins. And then in the bottom row, there's 2 organizations you can join. First, we have the Zeppelin Airship Collectors. That's a Facebook group, so you have to be on Facebook, but there are no dues. People post images of from their collections, tell about them, and other people then make comments and answer questions. And on the right, we have the RG Zeppelin Post. This is a German organization, and they have a website and regular meetings. Both groups meet at stamp shows. So at the left, Zeppelin and Airship Collectors will be meeting at Great American Stamp Show in the United States in August. And on the right, RG Zeppelin Post will be meeting at Bernaba. They'll have a booth there in May this year. So there's an active Zeppelin collecting community, and I hope many of you will consider thinking about how Zeppelins would fit into your own airmail collecting. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. Absolutely fantastic and very, very interesting talk. It's just amazing, how interesting something like Zeppelin mail can be. And would you like to just talk a little bit about your efforts in spreading the Zeppelin, the sort of fever, to more and more airmail collectors? And, how do we bring it in more into the mainstream of airmail collecting?
Well, I collect not only Zeppelin mail, but Zeppelin ephemera and artifacts. So Zeppelins have been my focus for a long, long time. And at the same time, I'm very passionate and love to share what I know and encourage others. because I do find it, especially for those who like to do scholarship, to be a very rewarding field. And so we do have, within the Zeppelin community, we have a very strong, active, serious group. In our Zeppelin Airship Collector group on Facebook, I think we have about 1,700 followers. But, you're talking maybe 150 to 200 are the serious collectors. You'll find that since we don't have published study group newsletters like we used to have, that we don't have the publication, one specific publication anymore, that's Zeppelin articles. So people like myself tend to publish in a variety of journals. And actually, I think that can be good because it's a way of reaching larger audiences just rather than talking to ourselves. And when we have meetings at stamp shows, we tend to have a pretty good turnout, anywhere from 25 and up, in a room. And at the Boston International Show coming up in 2026, we've already got 4 programs that'll be given. One will be an expert panel with several collectors doing a single item kind of show and tell. And then 3 talks that will be much more detailed. And when we have these kind of meetings, we always have door prizes, question answers, and do things to kind of inspire people along the way.
Thank you, Cheryl. I'll move on to some of the comments and questions that are in our chat. So Paul Sobon has a question about what percentage of Zeppelin mail was true commercial or private versus philatelic covers? Did the mix change over time? For example, more philatelic at the start, less over time?
We've had, I'd say, more philatelic over time. At the same time, for people looking for it, there's a fair amount of commercial mail and family mail, and then passenger and crew mail. So I think when you talk commercial, you have to very clearly define what you mean by that, if you just mean from bank to bank. But to me, if you have a passenger in flight sending cards to his family and friends who are not stamp collectors, and he's using the postal facilities on board, I do qualify that as also a commercial usage, just as if I was on vacation myself going somewhere and would send cards to family and friends. You find a lot of family mail because especially German immigrants to the United States and South America, very strong Germanic communities. So a lot of mail going back and forth. It might look philatelic, but you have to look at the address and the addressee and find out, oh my gosh, they got the same last name. And every once in a while you find a postcard with a message or a letter inside if you're lucky. One example, there's a Hindenburg crash postcard that says on the back, from a brother to another brother, how come you don't write to me anymore? And it ended up being crash mail. So the guy finally got a letter from his brother and it ended up being burnt. So an exact percentage has to be a wild guess. I would say on South American flights, you probably have more commercial mail than North American flights. It also operated for more years, and German industry set up more companies and banks in South America. The United States was more established, and so there was more competition there. So it was a different thing. But certainly, easily 10% of the mail had to be commercial.
Thank you. He has a follow-on question. Who made these Zeppelin treaties? The relevant national postal authorities, government, trade, or commercial officers?
So they were made often by Hugo Echner himself or one of his agents. And so he had agents in several countries. Willy von Meister was the agent in New York City. And he went to the post office regularly to negotiate contracts or treaties. He had agents in Brazil and Uruguay. I did an article on that once. Certainly in Germany and other countries. So it literally, if you were representing the Zeppelin company Eckner could designate who would represent them to go to the post office in a foreign country. And he had good enough relations with the Ministry of Posts in Berlin that they trusted him to make those discussions. And clearly they had said what their percentage or share of the intake should be. So it was knock on the door, write a letter, and say, I want to have a meeting and I want to talk about this. So, for example, the 1933 Chicago flight, 85 cents went to the Zeppelin company, 15 cents went to the United States Post Office. So it gives you an idea of how important that money was for the Zeppelin company to offset its operating expenses. When Hugo Eckner went to the International Stamp Show in 1936 in New York City, he thanked the stamp collectors because he said without them, they couldn't have afforded to build up the company and operated the flights. That their income was crucial, because once I did an evaluation of the cost of a passenger, how much they paid for their ticket versus the cost of feeding them and taking care of them with staff. Mail, all you had to do is put the mail bag in the locker and unload it, and it was all pure profit. So carrying the mail was absolutely essential to covering their operating expenses.
Right. Gary Lowe has a comment followed with a question. Treaty mail is largely a misnomer. These were in the vast majority of agreements postal conventions, quote unquote, agreements between postal authorities. Treaties are much higher level agreements between governments. Treaties require approval by legislatures and signed by heads of participating governments, but the term is still loosely used, much to my personal frustration, he writes. So his question is whether the agreement establishing the exchange office at Basel, along with all of the operating details, was a government treaty or a postal convention.
There's no evidence of it being a postal convention. The only thing I can assume, because I've never found I've only found the original letters for the United States mail, and I have to assume others operated the same way. And since Switzerland was right across the lake, it was an easy train ride for Eckner to go see the postal officials in Switzerland. I would guess that he just went over there with an appointment and they made a deal. But my point with the use of the term treaty mail is that it has a history of being used. It's used in the catalogs for Zeppelin mail. And I think because of its tradition and use, it can still be used for what it was. I understand you'd like to think UPU set Zeppelin rates and standards, but they didn't.
Right. Sowen has a comment, fabulous talk. There is so much to learn. I'll go through the YouTube videos again later. Congratulations again to all the participants. A big thank you to the extended organizers for making this happen. Superb platform to exchange philatelic knowledge. Paul has a comment on your talk. Just a comment. Amazed at the knowledge level of these exchange postal clerks, timings, rates, etc. Wow. Alex has applauded. Flavio Riccitelli, very interesting and detailed report. Thank you very much. Lots of applause from many people, including Alessandro Testa, Adam Cook, Naveen Osi, Akhil Reddy, and Peter Whitmere. So I think that's what we have for you, Cheryl. But again, thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening. I love sharing what I do, and I love getting the feedback. Thank you.